The Denver Broncos have fired head coach Nathaniel Hackett 15 games into his first season in control of the football team. How does this impact the Broncos? What are they going to do with just 2 games remaining on top of that? Who are some potential candidates, top candidates, intriguing candidates that suddenly become on the list here for this Broncos team? And how does it impact Russell Wilson and the future outlook of his status with the team? We dive into that and much more on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Welcome into a brand new episode of Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country for tuning in and making Locked on Broncos your first listen of the day. Every single day, free and available everywhere you get your podcasts in audio format or whether you watch on YouTube. Have some breaking news on today's episode of the show as the Broncos officially parted ways with first-year head coach Nathaniel Hackett. What type of implications does this have across the board for Denver for the remainder of the season and going into the offseason here? We'll dive into that on today's episode of the show. From the South Stands to the End Zone, I'm your host, as always, Cody Rourke, Broncos reporter from Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by my co-host, Sarah Bettinger, site expert, predominantlyorange.com. Sarah, you and I were saying yesterday after the Broncos' bad loss on Christmas Day to the Los Angeles Rams, I had to travel 3.5 hours to get home, right, from where I was visiting family and whatnot. And I said, watch, they're going to make a move tomorrow while I have to travel. Certainly enough, as I was just barely beginning my trek back home to Denver, that was the case. The Broncos have moved on from Nathaniel Hackett after just one season in control as the Broncos head coach, 15 games into it. And this is kind of an unprecedented move that we've seen historical around the NFL. There was the Urban Meyer situation last year because of negligent behavior, but for Hackett, this is a performance-based decision 15 games into the year. The Broncos ownership group stepping in, and Sarah, ultimately, CEO Greg Penner issued a statement here. Let's pull it up on the screen for those who are watching on YouTube. He says, on behalf of our ownership and organization, I want to thank Nathaniel Hackett for his dedication as head coach of the Denver Broncos. We sincerely appreciate Nathaniel's efforts and wish him the best and his family in the future. Following extensive conversations with George and our ownership group, we determined a new direction would ultimately be in the best interest of the Broncos. This change was now made out of respect for everyone involved and allows us to immediately begin the search for a new head coach. What is interesting, and obviously you can read it as we talk here, to me, what is very interesting is what he says right here. Moving forward, we will carefully evaluate every aspect of our football operations and make whatever changes are necessary to restore this franchise's winning tradition. First step here, Nathaniel Hackett, gone.
Nathaniel Hackett is out, and really that statement, it gives off the vibe that George Paton is obviously going to be safe for the time being, Cody, which I think is another big question that people have. There's 3 dominoes that everybody's looking at, right? Obviously, the big one has fallen that people really expected Nathaniel Hackett getting fired, although we kind of talked in recent weeks before the Rams game, of course, about how it kind of seemed like, man, maybe he hasn't really lost that locker room. Maybe the players do really like him. Maybe they are really playing for him. They certainly were playing hard against the Chiefs. They certainly played hard against the Cardinals, but now the other dominoes, it's like, okay, what does this mean then for George Paton? Well, it sounds like Greg Penner and the ownership group are behind George Paton, at least for another year, going to give him the opportunity to go out there and fix this and see what we can do about getting back to the winning ways in Denver. The statement shows a commitment from this ownership group. I know that a lot of people like to talk about the idea that these aren't necessarily football people, right? They're coming from the business world, or they're coming from the entertainment world. But obviously, this is an ownership group that paid $4.65 billion to run a winning football franchise. They want to win, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to win. So I think obviously you get the guys and gals into a room and you say, okay, look, what do we need to do to win? Well, they ultimately decided you got to move on from the head coach, but George Paton is going to stick around for the 2023 season. And I think the last straw was really that Christmas Day game against the Los Angeles Rams, right? I mean, that was an embarrassment on the field. Off to the side of the field, you got Dalton Reisner shoving Brett Rippon. You got Randy Gregory punching a guy in the face. And now we know that he's suspended for a game for doing so and bragging about it afterwards. So, I mean, it was one of those things where kind of like you lifted up the rug and you see all these bugs and dead things underneath, and you're like, oh, okay, all right, well, I guess there's more there than maybe we necessarily thought, or that was, maybe ready to bubble over. So the Broncos moving on from Nathaniel Hackett, committing to George Paton. We'll kind of see what happens next.
Well, and for those who are wondering who will serve as the interim head coach with just 2 games remaining, Jerry Rosburg, who was brought in after some clock management issues early on in the season for the Broncos. Rosburg obviously has a lot of respect around the National Football League. He helps Nathaniel Hackett, or helped Nathaniel Hackett a lot in the booth with, hey, he's got a better look at a replay. Okay, hey, let's throw the challenge flag on this one. He was also the associate head coach to John Harbaugh in Baltimore. So there is some element there, and we'll see how it's received. Players were informed on Monday of the decision there, obviously by the organization, to make Rosburg the interim head coach at this point in time. And there's so many other questions, right? So many ripple effects that, firing Nathaniel Hackett, what does it mean for other coaches like Dwayne Stukes? What does it mean for guys like Ejiro Evero? These are something we'll dive into this week on Locked On Broncos. George Paton will have a press conference alongside Greg Penner on Tuesday. We'll have all the coverage here, Locked On Broncos, all the recap and fallout from that. But you're right. I mean, Sarah, what we saw on Sunday, outside, how bad the score was, just the other stuff, right? The other stuff that has really nothing to do with football trickling in. And, I could tell you, being there every day, being at practice, being at games, being in the locker room with these guys, we never got the vibe. And I don't think that the locker room was entirely lost necessarily, but frustration, especially with how early and how big Denver got down against the Rams. Football's frustrating. And so obviously we saw the whole Dalton Reisner, Brett Rippon thing. That's not a good look, especially for a team that's losing, getting blown out as bad as they are. And as you mentioned, the whole Randy Gregory thing after the game, it's unnecessary. That stuff is just extra stuff that serves to what are we doing? It takes away from the importance, of the game of football, wins and losses and everything like that. It's just unnecessary stuff. And when you're losing, when you're struggling, Sarah, what happens? The magnifying glass on those issues get a little bit bigger. So there's a lot to break down. And obviously, I think everyone in Broncos country is wondering, well, because Denver now made the move, they can get an early jump on interviewing potential head coaching candidates. Well, who are some of the top or more likely candidates here that the Broncos could take a look at? We'll dive into that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. This episode of the show is brought to you by our friends over there at the Ultimate Football GM. I'm really geeked out about our new partner and the sponsor of today's episode of the show, the mobile game Ultimate Football GM. If you've ever dreamed of becoming an NFL GM and managing your football franchise, this is the app for you, because now your dream can come true, and this game will be everything that you look for when it comes to roster management. You can manage every strategic aspect of your team, play through the season, and lead your team to glory. You'll be responsible for hiring the right coaches and coordinators. Ironic enough that this episode is breaking down Nathaniel Hackett being fired. You can maybe put yourself in the situation of a GM. What would you do with the roster going forward? Trading players, making draft picks. You also get to navigate your franchise through free agency in the draft and all the ups and downs of a season. All this in a challenging, realistic game where Ultimate Football GM is completely free and playable offline. You could play on the go as you want, when you want to. Lockdown Broncos listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using the promo Locked On in all caps in the game store. That's Locked On in all caps, so make sure to check it out today. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up on the App Store. That's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. Who are some potential head coaching candidates for the 2023 season that this Broncos football team, ownership specifically, will take a look at? Just want to say thank you so much, Broncos country, tuning in, making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day, every single day, all year long. We have you covered through the season, training camp, preseason, OTAs, NFL free agency, the scouting combine, the NFL draft. We have an episode for you every single day on your favorite audio podcasting platform where you can watch us in video format on YouTube. Thank you so much, Broncos country. We appreciate you. Sarah, I mean, now the next step is who will be the next head coach for the Broncos. And look, I think we have to provide some context on this situation. The ownership group, they were not in place the moment that Nathaniel Hackett was previously hired by this team, by George Paton. So that's something that you absolutely have to consider when you factor in this. They didn't have any allegiance necessarily to Nathaniel Hackett, so I think it made it easier for them to pull the plug. But now Denver gets a chance to get a jump start on interviewing candidates at this point in time. And Dan Quinn's name has suddenly emerged at the top of the list as somebody to watch for Denver. Obviously, he has some former familiarity with Russell Wilson when the time they spent together in Seattle. But the other thing, too, Brian Schottenheimer's name is attached as a potential offensive coordinator prospect. In your opinion, what do you want to see in the Broncos head coaching search there?
Well, I think that's an interesting place to start right there, right? Dan Quinn, he and George Payton also, I believe, share an agent. They were also in Miami together once upon a time way back when, and he and Schottenheimer are currently in Dallas together, so it kind of makes sense that they're getting the ball rolling there. But it'll be interesting to see, Cody. Obviously, the Cowboys defense right now not having the best of months as we approach the playoffs, as was the case last year around this time as well. Not that that means he's a bad head coaching candidate by any means. I'm sure he would consider keeping Ejiro Evero and those type of things. But really, to your question, what are we looking for? I think that's a great question. And tell us in the comments what you're looking for. I think immediately the snap reaction, the knee-jerk reaction, and maybe it's not even knee-jerk, is to say we want a guy with experience out there as the head coach of the Denver Broncos, right? You've gone through the Vance Joseph in the post-Gary Kubiak era here. Vance Joseph, first-time head coach, a rookie head coach. Vic Fangio, not really a rookie coach, but a first-year head coach when he was named the head coach back in 2019, but certainly a very experienced guy. And then obviously now Nathaniel Hackett, another rookie head coach who really floundered, obviously, and being one of two guys really since 1994 to do that. And as you mentioned, I thought it was a great note by you. Urban Meyers wasn't necessarily, although you could have said, performance-based. The Hackett thing was pretty much purely performance-based, but Urban Meyer, there was a lot of other weird stuff going on there. So certainly bordering on unprecedented in the modern football era. That's 2 since I've been alive, or 3 since I've been alive, Cody. So that's kind of crazy. So I think experience is something that you want to see from the next head coach. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean they're an experienced coordinator who's getting their first shot as a head coach? Does that mean that they have prior experience as a head coach? I think a lot of people fall into that latter category, right? They want the guy that's coming in to have previous experience as a head coach. And that's not a unanimous sentiment among Broncos country, I wouldn't say. But for me personally, my personal brand right now is somebody like Frank Reich, Cody, who's got the offensive mind, who could come in and work with Russell Wilson or any other quarterback that you would bring in beyond this year, because this is something I think that we have to really talk about and really address, is the fact that I don't think you can make this hire, and we'll talk about this more later even in the show, I don't think you can make this hire purely based on Russell Wilson. I think it has to be we love this head coach for the future of the Denver Broncos, not we love this head coach because of Russ.
And look, there's so many factors here, because this is the ripple effect of having to make a change like this, right? I firmly believe Broncos fans have been very vocal about this, and this is something that Greg Penner touched on. Greg Penner is going to be in charge of this next head coaching search with support from George Payton. Damani Leach, I think, is going to have a very important role in this as well. The bigger question is like, regardless, right? Denver, the next head coach, whether they're a first-year head coach, which I know has a lot of Broncos fans like, hey, let's not do this again, versus the experienced head coach, regardless, Sarah, I think that ownership, whoever they decide to hire next, they need to make the commitment to this next coach, regardless. And I like what you mentioned about Russell Wilson. Look, the Broncos ownership group committed so much money to Russell Wilson. I still go back to what Greg Penner said here. Moving forward, we will carefully evaluate every aspect of our football operations and make whatever changes are necessary to restore this franchise's winning tradition. Getting rid of Nathaniel Hackett doesn't necessarily mean that the Broncos offense is all of a sudden going to be better. There's still some things that you and I and everybody in Broncos country, if you don't have any glasses on it, Russell Wilson has struggled. He has not looked good. He has made poor decisions in the passing game, right? But you want to be able to see, at least give it another year, right? But there might be a notion. Let's say Broncos ownership says, you know what? This was a horrible mistake for us. We made the mistake of signing off on the contract extension. We will just pay out his contract. He's going to be guaranteed what you mentioned, $124 million regardless. Pay him the $124 million and maybe cut bait, maybe cut ties, maybe put money into where it could affect the Broncos financially, salary cap-wise. We'll have to see what they decide to do there. But I think that's a big, big if at this point. But I do like what you mentioned. The Broncos' next head coaching decision can't be based off of, okay, this is who Russell Wilson likes. You need a head coach I feel like can come in and set the bottom line. Russ, this is what we are going to do as a football team. And look, I think that the coaching staff has done a really good job kind of catering and being collaborative with Russell Wilson. Clearly, it has not worked. You mentioned Frank Reich. Everyone's so caught up on Sean Payton. But you know what? He's been assembling this super team as reported by ESPN's Adam Schefter this past weekend, including Vic Fangio being his defensive coordinator. That's kind of something they already have planned out. I can tell you this. Sean Payton is not interested in coming to the Denver Broncos. And I can guarantee you, the Broncos, they are not interested in trading draft capital to have to acquire Sean Payton. And if Vic Fangio is part of that package deal, that simply is not happening due to Vic's time in Denver. Vic is not going to come back to Denver, and Denver simply isn't going to bring Vic back from that standpoint, even if it was in a defensive coordinator position. There's other guys mentioned like Jim Harbaugh at Michigan. Can the Broncos lure him? We know he's more of this guy who wants some creative control. He wants his hands on things. So that means, okay, what's the point of having a general manager at this point? So that doesn't make it seem like that'll be a likely move. That's why, obviously, Dan Quinn, as the head coach, has been floated out as maybe the top interest, with Brian Schottenheimer coming over as the offensive coordinator, has a good relationship with Russell Wilson, but that can't be the reason that you decide to hide those guys. But I've also been told that if, in fact, the Broncos were to hire Dan Quinn and Brian Schottenheimer was going to be the OC, Ejiro Evero would stay on as the defensive coordinator, barring the fact that he got any head coaching job opportunity in 2023. They come from kind of the same coaching tree as well with Raheem Morris. So we shall see what happens here, Sarah. There's a lot of interesting angles to be pondered here with this team, and there's so much that we can't touch on in today's episode. Obviously, the Broncos firing Nathaniel Hackett is the news of the day here for Broncos country. As mentioned, there will be a press conference on Tuesday at the UCL Training Center. I will be there to hear from Greg Penner and George Paton on their decision to move forward and what is next for the organization, what is next for Russell Wilson and the offense, and how they plan on fixing this mess that has been created in the 2022 NFL season. One other thing we're going to dive into on today's episode of the show, though, pertains to Russell Wilson. How does this change the firing of Nathaniel Hackett, the looking at potential head coaching candidates? How does this impact Russell Wilson and his potential future with the team? That's something you're going to get on today's episode, Lockdown Broncos. This episode of the show is brought to you by our friends at Prize Picks, and Prize Picks is daily fantasy sports done right. With the Prize Picks app, you choose 2 to 5 players you're focused on heading into the week, and these players, they'll have a projection that's set by Prize Picks, and you simply choose whether or not they will have more or less than their Prize Picks projection, which could allow you to win 10 times your money on any entry. There's no competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections available. Download the Prize Picks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. If you deposit $100, Prize Picks will give you $100. If you deposit $50, Prize Picks will give you $50. Don't forget that the promo code LOCKEDON at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. How does the firing of Broncos head coach Nathaniel Hackett after 15 games impact Russell Wilson, ownership's perception of Russell Wilson, and how does it maybe present a solution for how the Broncos can maneuver with Wilson for as long as they are connected to him? Thank you so much, Broncos country, tuning in, making Lockdown Broncos your first listen of the day every single day on your favorite audio podcasting platform, or whether you watch on YouTube. We appreciate you so much. Make sure you share your thoughts down below. If you're watching on YouTube, in the YouTube comment section, make sure to like the video, comment for the algorithm, or you can tweet us anytime on Twitter at Cody Rourke NFL, at Sarah Bettinger, at Lockdown Broncos. Sarah, what does this mean for Russell Wilson? As we all know, right? You know, George Paton has received a lot of fire from fans, rightfully so. There's a lot of criticism to be had there for extending Russell Wilson without him playing it down, but it has been confirmed. Ownership wanted to get this done before the season began. They wanted to get this done ahead of time. You and I have done multiple episodes on this podcast talking about the reasons why they did it, the reasons why they should have waited to do it. You and I aren't leaning a specific way, but we're looking at every side of the coin, which I think is super important for fans. I think it's important for anybody who tunes into the show to get both sides of it. So there is that. We know that ownership signed off on the massive extension for Russell Wilson, but in your opinion, Sarah, what does this mean for Russ and his future, as we've talked about potential head coaching candidates, and we just talk about how this team has played, and more importantly, how Russell Wilson has simply played under center?
I think we're going to find out a lot about what this franchise from the ownership on down thinks about Russell Wilson and his future as an NFL quarterback based on this head coaching search. And I know Mike Kliss, 9 News Insider, one of our friends of the show, he had tweeted something out about, he perceives that this move is about, the ownership really believing in Russ and really wanting to support him and believe that he hasn't dropped off as much as we've seen this year. And that's kind of what, I have said. And I don't know if you necessarily agree with me, Cody. I tend to kind of just refuse to believe or refuse to accept that Russ has fallen off this much in terms of just like this is where he's at now. Like he's dropped off in 2022. Clearly, we can't dispute that. But is that just what he is now? That's what I refuse to believe, that he's all the way down here and that's where he's going to stay. I tend to believe this is more of an outlier. I'm interested to see, does the ownership group, does the front office, George Paton, do they agree with that? Do they think that? Do they see that from Russ? What was their day-to-day interaction with Russ like? The perception of Russell Wilson right now, Cody, and we'll talk about this all offseason. Really, we will, because that's what there's going to be to talk about. There's not going to be any, hey, the Broncos did this in the playoffs to talk about. There's nothing. There's not going to be any of that. It's all going to be about Russell Wilson. What do they do at the quarterback position? But what is the ownership group like? What do they think of Russ as a person? What do they think of his entourage, for lack of a better term? What do they think about his persona, his brand, his celebrity? What do they think about every single piece and aspect of Russ? Because man, I'm sure they got to know him over the first couple months that they were the owners in Denver. And even when those rumors started coming about, I'm sure they met with Russell Wilson and got to know him a little bit then. Now you've had an entire season. George Paton as well. I mean, George Paton has been with him since March. So it's going to be very, very interesting, especially with George Paton potentially on the quote-unquote hot seat, right, going into 2023. I don't think we can definitively say he's safe for the foreseeable future. It's like he's safe for now, and that's all we can really say. What do they think of Russell Wilson? Because that it's gonna. I know I said in the previous segment that you can't base the coaching hire on Russell Wilson, but I do think obviously you want to salvage that investment. I don't think the Broncos are going to try to find any way they can to get out of their contract with Russell Wilson, but I may be surprised by what they end up doing there. This coaching hire and this decision of how the franchise is going to move forward, it's going to be fascinating to see, to be able to read the tea leaves, to be able to pick up the breadcrumbs. What do these people from the top down actually think of Russell Wilson? Are they going to bring in better competition at QB? What is this head coach going to guarantee in terms of, hey, we're behind Russell? What's their verbiage going to be? The PR spin on everything. It's going to be very, very fascinating to see, because that is going to kind of determine whether or not, we're sweating throughout the offseason, wondering about the quarterback position, or just kind of at least resting easy, knowing that, okay, they are going to get behind Russ. They're going to try to fix Russ, and that's what we can plan on for 2023.
Well, we just received a tweet from Tom Pelissero. Says Broncos GM George Paton informed players the team offered the interim head coaching job to DC Giro Evero, who decided with 2 weeks left it was best for the team if he keeps working with the defense. Evero will be a candidate for head coaching jobs, including in Denver. So this is also another interesting development to follow. Part of me also thinks, too, maybe Evero's decision, right, to turn it down. I mean, we know how great of a friend, like he and Nathaniel Hackett are best friends. They're best man at each other's weddings. Like, that stuff is super important. So I think maybe out of respect, there is that. I can tell you this, players absolutely love Ejiro Evero 110%. He will be in the mix. It'll be interesting to see if the Broncos decide to go that direction and offer him the head coaching job. And if they do, would he take it? I mean, these are all these things that you mentioned, right? Or we're going to be sweating throughout the offseason trying to figure out how quick will the Broncos make their decision is going to be a very interesting point. As we know, Dan Quinn and the Cowboys, if he is a candidate that they're super interested in, they are about to maybe potentially be in the playoffs. So how does that impact maybe his preparation? Does he wait till the Cowboys are eliminated? Can the Broncos wait to afford, like if they really want a guy like Dan Quinn to interview for the job, can they afford to wait for him? Will they do that? Like, there are so many things, Sarah, that I think are really outside of the control of the Broncos that make this a very, very interesting dilemma. And as you mentioned, I believe, right, as bad as Russell Wilson has played, I believe you at least have to give it another season. Now, granted, we're going to be having the same conversation, okay? Brand new season, brand new head coach, brand new play caller on offense, probably a brand new offense. How does this impact the Broncos? How does this impact the chemistry standpoint? You also have to factor in Greg Penner is a guy who goes around the locker room. He talks to guys one-on-one. He pulls guys in. He asks them about certain things. Part of me also wonders, how is the locker room's perception of Russell Wilson? Does he have the respect of his teammates still? I know you saw the Dan Orlovsky thing that kind of came out that, he and Ryan Clark, they were saying, like, okay, you're down 45 points and you're sitting there covering your mouth with a football trying to whisper and talk to your guys. Like, I don't know. I think that's a little bit too big of a big deal to be making, but it's just one of these things because the Broncos are in the position that they're in. Stuff like that gets magnified. It spreads like wildfire, and it creates a lot of negative opinions on the subject matter. I personally believe, as bad as Russell Wilson has played, and trust me, I'm like, hey, I even said it. I said it during Christmas. I tweeted out the Broncos should just let it rip for these final 2 games. You have to see what you have with Russ after this upcoming year, and then I think the ownership group will make a calculated decision. But as you said, we can learn to expect the unexpected with this franchise, with this organization, and certainly we will have you covered every step of the way here on the Locked On Broncos podcast. Broncos Country, drop your thoughts down below. What are your thoughts on the Broncos' decision to fire Nathaniel Hackett? What would you like to see in the next head coach for this franchise? All these circumstances, we are eager for your thoughts. Get in the conversation down below if you're on YouTube, or tweet us on Twitter at Cody Rourke NFL, at Sarah Bettinger, at Locked On Broncos. George Payton, Greg Penner will meet with the media Tuesday morning. We'll have all the coverage here, Locked On Broncos.